Hi, happy, what is it, Monday? Happy Monday. I took a little bit of a break. Now we're back. We are reading Emma by Jane Austen. And actually, my boyfriend had the idea of maybe starting like a little book club type thing for the next one where we can just kind of have a little bit of an open forum and discuss the chapters after we're done the chapters. So I'll do that for the next book, which I think is going to be Pride and Prejudice, because someone asked when I was reading that. So I will do that one next. Anyways, Emma by Jane Austen. We are on chapter 27. How did we end off? Because we took a bit of a break. Oh yes, they were having a dinner party. Okay, chapter 7. Emma did not repent her condescension in going to the Coles. The visit afforded her many pleasant recollections the next day, and all that she might be supposed to have lost on the side of dignified seclusion must be amply repaired in the splendor of popularity. She must have delighted the Coles, worthy people who deserved to be made happy, and left a name behind her that would not soon die away. Perfect happiness, even in memory, is not common, and there were 2 points on which she was not quite easy. She doubted whether she had not transgressed the duty of woman by woman in betraying her suspicions of Jane Fairfax's feelings to Frank Churchill. It was hardly right, but it had been so strong an idea that it would escape her, and his submission to all that she told was a compliment to her penetration, which made it difficult for her to be quite certain that she ought to have held her tongue. The other circumstance of regret related also to Jane Fairfax, and there she had no doubt. She did unfeignedly and unequivocally regret the inferiority of her own playing and singing. She did most heartily grieve over the idleness of her childhood, and sat down and practiced vigorously an hour and a half. She was then interrupted by Harriet's coming in, and if Harriet's praise could have satisfied her, she might soon have been comforted. "Oh, but if I could play as well as you and Miss Fairfax." "Don't class us together, Harriet. My playing is no more like hers than a lamp is like the sunshine." "Oh, dear, I think you play the best, the 2 of you. I think you play quite as well as she does. I am sure I had much rather hear you. Everybody last night said how well you played." "Those who knew anything about it must have felt the difference. The truth is, Harriet, that my playing is just good enough to be praised, but Jane Fairfax's is much beyond it." "Well, I always shall think that you play quite as well as she does, or that if there is any difference, nobody would ever find it out. Mr. Cole said how much taste you had, and Mr. Frank Churchill talked a great deal about your taste, and that he valued much more than execution. Oh, and that he valued taste much more than execution." "Oh, but Jane Fairfax has them both, Harriet." "Are you sure? I saw she had execution, but I did not know she had any taste. Nobody talked about it. And I hate Italian singing. There is no understanding a word of it. Besides, if she does play so very well, you know, it is no more than she is obliged to do, because she will have to teach. The Coxes were wondering last night whether she would get into any great family. Do you think the Coles looked?" How did you think the Coles looked? Wow, okay. Clearly it's Monday. Clearly it's been a while. "Just as they always do. Very vulgar." "They told me something," said Harriet rather hesitatingly, "but it is nothing of any consequence." Emma was obliged to ask what they had told her, though fearful of its producing Mr. Elton. "They told me that Mr. Martin dined with them last Saturday." "Oh!" "He came to their father upon some business, and he asked him to stay to dinner." "Oh!" "They talked a great deal about him, especially Anne Cox. I did not know what she meant, but she asked me if I thought I should go and stay there again next summer." She meant to be impertinently curious, just as such an Anne Cox could be. "She said he was very agreeable the day he dined there. He sat by her at dinner. Miss Nash thinks either of the Coles would be very glad to marry him. Either of the Coxes would be very glad to marry him." "Very likely. I think they are, without exception, the most vulgar girls in Highbury." Harriet had business at Ford's. Emma thought it most prudent to go with her. Another accidental meeting with the Martins was possible, and, in her present state, would be dangerous. Harriet, tempted by everything and swayed by half a word, was always very long at a purchase, and while she was still hanging over muslins and changing her mind, Emma went to the door for amusement. Much could not be hoped from the traffic of even the busiest part of Highbury. Mr. Perry walking hastily by, Mr. William Cox letting himself in at the office door, Mr. Coles's carriage horses returning from exercise, or a stray letter boy on an obstinate mule, were the liveliest objects she could presume to expect. And when her eyes fell only on the butcher with his tray, the tidy old woman travelling homewards from shop with her full basket, 2 curs quarrelling over a dirty bone, and a string of dawdling children round the baker's little bow window eyeing the gingerbread, she knew she had no reason to complain, and was amused enough. quite enough to stand still at the door. A mind lively and at ease can do with seeing nothing and can see nothing that does not answer. She looked down the Randalls Road. The scene enlarged. 2 persons appeared, Mrs. Weston and her son-in-law. They were walking in Highbury, to Hartfield, of course. They were stopping, however, in the first place at Mrs. Bates's, whose house was a little nearer Randalls than Ford's, and had all but knocked when Emma caught their eye. Immediately they crossed the road and came forward to her, and the agreeableness of yesterday's engagement seemed to give fresh pleasure to the present meeting. Mrs. Weston informed her that she was going to call on the Bateses in order to hear the new instrument. "For my companion tells me," said she, "that I absolutely promised Miss Bates last night that I would come this morning. I was not aware of it myself. I did not know that I had fixed a day, but as he said I did, I am going now. And while Mrs. Weston pays her visit, I may be allowed, I hope," said Mr. Frank Churchill, "to join your party and wait for her at Hartfield, if you are going home." Mrs. Weston was disappointed. "I thought you meant to go with me. They would be very much pleased." "Me? I should be quite in the way. But, perhaps, I may be equally in the way here. Miss Woodhouse looks as if she did not want me. My aunt always sends me off when she is shopping. She says I fidget her to death, and Miss Woodhouse looks as if she could almost say the same. What am I to do?" "I am here on no business of my own," said Emma. "I am only waiting for a friend. She will probably have soon done, and then we shall go home. But you had better go with Mrs. Weston and hear the instrument." "Well, if you advise it. But if Colonel Campbell should have employed a careless friend, and if it should prove to have an indifferent tone, what shall I say? I shall be no support to Mrs. Weston. She might do very well by herself. A disagreeable truth would be palatable through her lips, but I am the wretchedest being in the world at a civil falsehood." "I do not believe any such thing," replied Emma. "I am persuaded that you can be as insincere as your neighbours when it is necessary, but there is no reason to suppose the instrument is indifferent. Quite otherwise, indeed, if I understood Miss Fairfax's opinion last night." "Do come with me," said Mrs. Weston, "if it be not very disagreeable to you. It need not detain us long. We will go to Hartfield afterwards. We will follow them to Hartfield. I really wish you to call with me. It will be felt so great an attention, and I always thought you meant it." "Hello." He could say no more, and with the hope of Hartfield to reward him, returned with Mrs. Weston to Mrs. Bates's door. Emma watched them in, and then joined Harriet at the interesting counter, trying with all the force of her own mind to convince her that if she wanted plain muslin, it was of no use to look at figurehead, and that a blue ribbon, be it ever so beautiful, would still never match her yellow pattern. At last it was all settled, even to the destination of the parcel. "Should I send it to Mrs. Goddard's, ma'am?" asked Mrs. Ford. Yes, to Mrs. Goddard's. Only my pattern gown is at Hartfield." "No, you shall send it to Hartfield, if you please. But then Mrs. Goddard will want to see it, and I could take the pattern gown home any day. But I shall want the ribbon directly, so it had better go to Hartfield. At least the ribbon." "You could make it into 2 parcels, Mrs. Ford, could you not?" "It is not worth while, Harriet, to give Mrs. Ford the trouble of 2 parcels. "No more it is." "No trouble in the world, ma'am," said the obliging Mrs. Ford. "I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?" "Oh, but indeed I would much rather have it only in one. Then, if you please, you shall send it to Mrs. Goddard's. I do not know. No, I think, Miss Woodhouse, I may just as well have it sent to Hartfield and take it home with me at night. What do you advise?" "That you do not give yourself another half-second to the subject. To Hartfield, if you please, Mrs. Ford." "Aye, that will be much best," said Harriet, quite satisfied. "I should not at all like to have it sent to Mrs. Goddard's." Voices approached to the step, or, rather, one voice and 2 ladies. Mrs. Weston and Miss Bates met them at the door. "My dear Miss Woodhouse," said the latter, "I am just run across to entreat the favour of you to come and sit down with us a little while, and give your opinion of our new instrument. You and Mrs. Smith." "How do you do, Miss Smith?" "I very well, I thank you. And I begged Mrs. Weston to come with me, that I might be sure of succeeding." "I hope Mrs. Bates and Miss Fairfax are—" "Very well, I am much obliged to you. My mother is delightfully well, and Jane caught no cold last night. How is Mr. Woodhouse? I am so glad to hear such a good account. Mrs. Weston told me you were here." "Oh, then," said I must run across the street. I am sure Mrs. Woodhouse would allow me just to run across and entreat her to come in. My mother will be so very happy to see her. And now we are such a nice party, she cannot refuse." "You pray do," said Mr. Frank Churchill. "Mrs. Woodhouse's opinion of the instrument will be worth having." "But," said I shall be more sure of succeeding if one of you will go with me." "Oh," said he, "wait half a minute, till I have finished my job. For, would you believe it, Miss Woodhouse, there he is, in the most obliging manner in the world, fastening in the rivet of my mother's spectacles. The rivet came out, you know, this morning. So very obliging, for my mother had no use of her spectacles, could not put them on. And by the by, everybody ought to have 2 pair of spectacles. They should indeed. Jane said so. I meant to take them over to John Saunders the first thing I did, but something or other hindered me all the morning. The first one thing, then another, saying there is no saying what, you know. At one time, Patty came to say she thought the kitchen chimney wanted sweeping. Oh, said I, Patty, do not come with your bad news to me. Here is the rivet of your mistress's spectacles out. Then the baked apples came home. Mrs. Wallace sent them by her boy. They are extremely civil and obliging to us, the Wallaces, always. I have heard some people say that Mrs. Wallace can be uncivil and give a very rude answer, but we have never known anything but the greatest attention from them. And it cannot be for the value of our custom now, for what is our consumption of bread, you know? Only 3 of us. Besides dear Jane at present, and really she eats nothing. Makes such a shocking breakfast, you would really be quite frightened if you saw it. I dare not let my mother know how little she eats. So I say one thing, and then I say another, and it passes off. But about the middle of the day she gets hungry, and there is nothing she likes so well as these baked apples, and they are extremely wholesome, for I took the opportunity the other day of asking Mr. Perry. I happened to meet him in the street. Not that I had any doubt before. I have so often heard Mr. Woodhouse recommend a baked apple. I believe it is only the way that Mr. Woodhouse thinks the fruit thoroughly wholesome. We have apple dumplings, however, very often. Patty makes an excellent apple dumpling. Well, Mrs. Weston, you have prevailed, I hope, and these ladies will oblige us. She talks so much. Oh, my God. Emma would be very happy to wait on Mrs. Bates, etc., and they did at last move out of the shop with no further delay, for Mrs. Bates then, How do you do, Mrs. Ford? I beg your pardon. I did not see you before. I hear you have a charming collection of new ribbons from town. Jane came back delighted yesterday. Thank you. The gloves do very well. Only a little too large about the wrist, but Jane is taking them in. What was I talking of, said she, beginning again when they were all in the street. Emma wondered on what, of all the medley, she would fix. I declare I cannot recollect what I was talking of. Oh, my mother's spectacles. So very obliging of Mr. Frank Churchill. Oh, said he, I do think I can fasten the rivet. I like a job of this kind excessively, which showed him to be so very. Indeed, I must say that, much as I had heard of him before, and much as I had expected, he very far exceeds anything. I do congratulate you, Mrs. Weston, most warmly. He seems everything the fondest parent could. Oh, said he, I can fasten the rivet. I like a job of that sort excessively. I never shall forget his manner. And when I brought out the baked apples from the closet and hoped our friends would be so very obliging as to take some, oh, said he directly, there is nothing in the way of fruit half so good, and these are the finest looking home-baked apples I ever saw in my life. That, was so very, and I am sure by his manner it was no compliment. Indeed, they are very delightful apples, and Mrs. Wallace does them full justice. Only we do not have them baked more than twice, and Mr. Woodhouse made us promise to have them done 3 times. But Miss Woodhouse will be so good as not to mention it. The apples themselves are the very finest sort for baking, beyond a doubt, all from Donwell, some of Mr. Knightley's most liberal supply. He sends us a sack every year, and certainly there was never such a keeping apple anywhere as one of his trees. I believe there is 2 of them. My mother says the orchard always was famous in her younger days. But I was really quite shocked the other day, for Mr. Knightley called one morning, and Jane was eating these apples, and we talked about them and said how much she enjoyed them, and he asked whether we were not got to the end of our stock. I am sure you must be, said he, and I will send you another supply, for I have a great many more than I can ever use. William Larkins let me keep a larger quantity than usual this year. I will send you some more before they get good for nothing. So I begged he would not, for really, as ours being gone, I could not absolutely say that we had a great many left, but it was 6 indeed. But they should all be kept for Jane, and I could not at all bear that he should be sending us more, so liberal as he had been already, and Jane said the same. And when he was gone, she quarrelled with me. No, I should not say quarrelled, for we never saw a quarrel in our lives. But she was quite distressed that I had owned the apples were so nearly gone. She wished I had made him believe we had a great many left. Oh, said I, my dear, I did not say as much as I could. However, the very same evening, William Larkins came over with a large basket of apples, the same sort of apples, a bushel at least, and I was very much obliged, and went down and spoke to William Larkins and said everything, as you may suppose. William Larkins is such an old acquaintance. I am always glad to see him. But, however, I found afterwards from Patty that William said it was all the apples of that sort his master had. He had brought them all, and now his master had not one left to bake or boil. William did not seem to mind it himself. He was so pleased to think his master had sold so many. For William, thinks more of his master's profit than anything. But Mrs. Hodges, he said, was quite displeased at their being all sent away. She could not bear that her master should not be able to have another apple tart this spring. He told Patty this, but bid her not mind it, and be sure not to say anything to us about it, for Mrs. Hodges would be cross sometimes, and as so long as many sacks were sold, it did not signify who ate the remainder. And so Patty told me, and I was excessively shocked indeed. I would not have Mr. Knightley know anything about it for the world. He would be so very... I wanted to keep it from Jane's knowledge, but unluckily I had mentioned it before I was aware. Holy shit. This is just a wall of her text. I don't know. It's just that and then this. It's just her rambling on about these fucking apples. Mrs. Bates had just done as Patty opened the door, and her visitors walked upstairs without having any regular narration to attend to, pursued only by the sounds of her desultory goodwill. Pray take care, Mrs. Weston. There is a step at the turning. Pray take care, Mrs. Woodhouse. Ours is rather a dark staircase, rather darker and narrower than one could wish. Miss Smith, pray take care. Miss Woodhouse, I am quite concerned. I am sure you hit your foot. Miss Smith, the step at the turning. Shut the fuck up. Really, like enough. Chapter 28. The appearance of the little sitting room as they entered was tranquility itself. Mrs. Bates, deprived of her usual employment, slumbering on one side of the fire, Frank Churchill at a table near her, most deedily occupied about her spectacles, and Jane Fairfax, standing with her back to them, intent on her pianoforte. Busy as he was, however, the young man was yet able to show a most happy countenance on seeing Emma again. This is a pleasure, said he in a rather low voice, coming at least 10 minutes earlier than I had calculated. You find me trying to be useful. Tell me if you think I shall succeed. What, said Mrs. Weston, have you not finished it yet? Would you not earn a very good livelihood? You would not earn a very good livelihood as a working silversmith at this rate. I have not been working uninterruptedly, he replied. I have been assisting Miss Fairfax in trying to make her instrument stand steadily. It was not quite firm. An unevenness in the floor, I believe. You see, we have been wedging one leg with paper. This was very kind of you to be persuaded to come. I was almost afraid you would be hurrying home. He contrived that she should be seated by him, and was sufficiently employed in looking out the best baked apple for her, and trying to make her help or advise him in his paperwork. Trying to help her or advise him in his work, till Jane Fairfax was quite ready to sit down to the pianoforte again. That she was not immediately ready, Emma did suspect to arise from the state of her nerves. She had not yet possessed the instrument long enough to touch it without emotion. She must reason herself into the power of performance, and Emma could not but pity such feelings, whatever their origin, and could not but resolve never to expose them to her neighbour again. At last Jane began, and though the first bars were feebly given, the powers of the instrument were gradually done full justice to. Mrs. Weston had been delighted before and was delighted again. Emma joined her in all her praise, and the pianoforte, with every proper discrimination, was pronounced to be altogether of the highest promise. Whatever Colonel Campbell might employ, said Frank Churchill, with a smile at Emma, the person has not chosen ill. I heard a great deal of Colonel Campbell's taste at Weymouth, and the softness of the upper notes, I am sure, is exactly what he and all that party would particularly prize. I dare say, Miss Fairfax, that he either gave his friend very minute directions or wrote to Broadwood himself. Do you not think so? Jane did not look around. She was not obliged to hear. Mrs. Weston had been speaking to her at the same moment. It is not fair, said Emma in a whisper. Mine is a random guess. Do not distress her. It is not fair, said Emma in a whisper. Mine was a random guess. Do not distress her. He shook his head with a smile and looked as if he had very little doubt and very little mercy. Soon afterwards, he began again. How much your friends in Ireland must be enjoying your pleasure on this occasion, Miss Fairfax. I dare say they often think of you and wonder which will be the day, the precise day of the instrument's coming to hand. Do you imagine Colonel Campbell knows the business to be going forward just at this time? Do you imagine it to be the consequence of an immediate commission from him, or that he may have sent only a general direction, an order indefinite as to time, to depend upon contingencies and conveniences? He paused. She could not but hear. She could not avoid answering. Till I have a letter from Colonel Campbell, said she, in a voice of forced calmness. I can imagine nothing with any confidence. It must be all conjecture. Conjecture, aye. Sometimes one conjectures right, and sometimes one conjectures wrong. I wish I could conjecture how soon I shall make this rivet quite firm. What nonsense one talks, Miss Woodhouse, when hard at work, if one talks at all. Your real workmen, I suppose, hold their tongues. But we gentlemen labourers, if we get a hold of a word. Miss Fairfax said something about conjecturing. There, it is done. I have the pleasure, madam, to Mrs. Bates, of rejoicing your spectacles healed for the present. He was very warmly thanked both by mother and daughter. To escape a little from the latter, he went to the pianoforte, and begged Miss Fairfax, who was still sitting at it, to play something more. You are very kind, said he. It will be one of the waltzes we danced last night. Let me live them over again. You did not enjoy them as I did. You appeared tired the whole time. I believe you were glad we danced no longer, but I would have given words, all the words one has ever to give, for another half hour. She played. What felicity it is to hear a tune again which has made one happy. If I mistake not that we danced What felicity it is to hear a tune again which has made one happy. If I mistake not, that was danced at Weymouth. The wording is just hard to understand. It's just hard. She looked up at him for a moment, colored deeply, and played something else. He took some music from a chair near the pianoforte, and turning to Emma said, "Here's something quite new to me. Do you know it? Kramer. And here are a new set of Irish melodies. That, from such a quarter, one might expect." This was all sent with the instrument. Very thoughtful of Colonel Campbell, was it not? He knew Miss Fairfax could have no music here. I honor that part of the attention particularly. It shows to have been so thoroughly from the heart. Nothing hastily done, nothing incomplete. True affection only could have prompted it. Emma wished he would be less pointed, yet could not help being amused. And when, on glancing her eye towards Jane Fairfax, she caught the remains of a smile, when she saw that with all the deep blush of consciousness there had been a smile of secret delight, she had less scruple in the amusement, and much less compunction with respect to her. This amiable, upright, perfect Jane Fairfax was apparently cherishing very reprehensible feelings. He brought all the music to her, and they looked it over together. Emma took the opportunity of whispering, "You speak too plain. She must understand you." "I hope she does. I would have her understand me. I am not in the least ashamed of my meaning. But really, I am half ashamed, and wish I had never taken up the idea. I am very glad you did, and that she communicated it to me. I have now a key to all her odd looks and ways. Leave shame to her. If she does wrong, she ought to feel it. She is not entirely without it, I think. I do not see much sign of it. She is playing Robin Adair at this moment, his favourite." Shortly afterwards, Miss Bates, passing near the window, descried Mr. Knightley on horseback not far off. "Mr. Knightley, I declare, I must speak with him if possible, just to thank him. I will not open the window here. It would give you all cold, but I can go into my mother's room, you know. I dare say he will come in when he knows who is here. Quite delightful to have you all meet so, our little room so honoured." She was in the adjoining chamber while she still spoke, and opening the casement there, immediately called Mr. Knightley's attention, and every syllable of their conversation was as distinctly heard by the others as if it had passed within the same apartment. "How do you do? How do you do? Very well, I thank you. So obliged to you for the carriage last night. We were just in time. My mother just ready for us. Pray come in. Do come in. You will find some friends here." So began Miss Bates, and Mr. Knightley seemed determined to hear him in his turn, for most resolutely and commandingly did he say, "How is your niece, Miss Bates? I want to inquire after you all, but particularly your niece. How is Miss Fairfax? I hope she caught no cold last night. How is she today? Tell me, how is Miss Fairfax?" And Miss Bates was obliged to give a direct answer before he would hear anything else. The listeners were amused, and Mrs. Weston gave Emma a look of particular meaning. But Emma still shook her head in steady skepticism. "So obliged to you, so very much obliged to you for the carriage," resumed Miss Bates. He cut her short with, "I'm going to Kingston. Can I do anything for you?" "Oh, dear, Kingston, are you? Mrs. Cole was saying the other day she wanted something from Kingston." "Mrs. Cole has servants to send. Can I do anything for you?" "No, I thank you, but do come in. Who do you think is here?" "Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith, so kind as to call to hear the new pianoforte. Do put up your horse at the Crown and come in." "Well," said he in a deliberating manner, "for 5 minutes, perhaps. And here is Mrs. Weston and Mr. Frank Churchill, too. Quite delighted, so many friends." "No, not now, I thank you. I could not stay 2 minutes. I must get on to Kingston as fast as I can." "Oh, do come in. They will be so very happy to see you." No, your room is full enough. I will call another day and hear the pianoforte." "Well, I am so sorry. Oh, Mr. Knightley, what a delightful party last night. How extremely pleasant. Did you ever see such dancing? Was it not delightful? Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Frank Churchill, I never saw anything equal to it." "Oh, very delightful indeed. I can say nothing less, for I suppose Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Frank Churchill are hearing everything that passes. And," raising his voice still more, "I do not see why Miss Fairfax should not be mentioned too. I think Miss Fairfax dances very well, and Mrs. Weston is the very best country dance player, without exception, in England. Now, if your friends have any gratitude, they will say something pretty loud about you and me in return, but I cannot stay to hear it. Oh, Mr. Knightley, one moment more. Something of consequence. So shocked. Jane and I are both so shocked about the apples." "What is the matter now?" "To think of your sending us all your store apples. You said you had a great many, and now you have not one left. We really are so shocked. Mrs. Hodges may well be angry. William Larkins mentioned it here. You should not have done it. Indeed, you should not." "Oh, he is off. He can never bear to be thanked. But I thought he would have stayed now, and it would have been a pity not to have mentioned. Well," returning to the room, "I have not been able to succeed. Mr. Knightley cannot stop. He is going to Kingston. He asked if he could do anything." "Yes," said Jane. "We heard his kind offers. We heard everything." Oh, yes, my dear, I dare say you might, because, you know, the door was open and the window was open and Mr. Knightley spoke so loud. You must have heard everything, to be sure. Can I do anything for you at Kingston? Said he. So I just mentioned. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, must you be going? You seem but just come. So very obliging of you. Emma found it really time to be at home. The visit had already lasted so long, and on examining watches, so much of the morning was perceived to be gone, that Mrs. Weston and her companion, taking leave also, could allow themselves only to walk with 2 young ladies to Hartfield Gates before they set off for Randalls. Okay, those were not some of my favorite chapters, for a few reasons. One, it is very clear it's been a while since I've read aloud and I was busy all weekend and my voice is really not here. 2, it's fucking Miss Bates. God, she's the worst. She's just irritating, but we all know someone like that. Anyways, I have a YouTube channel, KA Reads Classics, one word, all one word, no space, same name as this channel. I will upload this video. I will upload the rest of the book if you want sort of like a live action audiobook vibe, because I swear I stumble, all that good jazz. We'll get through this book. We'll get through it, and then we'll do a different one. I didn't know what this one was about. I'm not really a fan. It's just kind of boring. It's all very society. But thank you so much for reading with me, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.